Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are really glad you're here. This conversation actually began as an article three of us wrote together, but in many ways, it also comes from our own journeys. All three of us stepped away from what looked like successful corporate careers on the outside, and over the years, through a lot of reflection and inner work, we have come to understand how deeply overthinking, pressure, and identity gets tied to our professional lives. So today, we work to help women break their overthinking patterns, find clarity, and move forward both professionally and personally. And the interesting part is that we come from three different industries: finance, technology, and HR. But while we were writing this article, we realized we had all experienced something surprisingly similar in our careers. And at different points, each of us had learned how to adapt in ways that helped us succeed, but also quietly shaped how we showed up at work. And before we go any further, it is important for me to say that this conversation is not about being anti corporate or anti performance. I think every workplace has certain expectations, and over time, we learn what gets rewarded, what gets us that promotion, and what quietly gets discouraged. So, naturally, people adjust how they show up at work. That adjustment is super normal. In many ways, it's how people build successful careers. But sometimes the adjustment becomes so normal that we stop noticing it. And that's really what this conversation is about: the moment when adaptation becomes unconscious. So, today we are going to explore this experience through three different parts. One, how performance sometimes begins as promotion. And second, what happens when success actually reinforces that mask? Third, the moment many professionals realize they're not simply exhausted, they're experiencing something much more profoundly deeper, which is disconnection. And as we move through this conversation, each of us here in this call will share what this looked like in our own careers, what we experienced, and what we did when we started noticing it. And everybody, I'm Vidya, and with me I have Gandharvi and Simmi. So, Simmi, from a finance lens, where numbers, risk, and stability are constantly in play, when did performance start feeling like professionalism and more like protection for you?
Hmm. That's a very good question, Vidya. And I would answer this question by sharing a story of my own life. So, I came from the background of investment banking and finance. And when I started my career in finance and investment banking, I was actually really enjoying it. The work, the grind, the new opportunities, because I was learning every single day new business models, new ways to do the finance work, and it was like really really lighting me up until one day I felt like something has shifted, and I was not aware of what the issue was. I just only knew that something has shifted, but I had no idea how to articulate it. I had no idea how to
Hmm.
name it, and I had no idea what even I call it and what's happening. So like any other person who has no clarity and they experience some sort of change, we have like this inner nature to point that change toward external. So I felt like maybe it's the work, maybe it's the culture, maybe it's the bosses, maybe it's that like I don't like this work anymore, I don't want this company anymore, the people are like not understanding me. And then we all have certain kind of like, if you're high achiever, you all have a self certain critic who always reminds you back that no, actually you are the problem. And my critic was saying, when I said no, actually you are stupid, you are not worth anything, you're not good enough, and now you're blowing it up, you should be very grateful, you have this career, you have this job, you have this opportunity, there are a lot of people who want this, it's their dream. and it was your dream and now you have it, and now it's like you are being ungrateful like the spoiled brat. What's wrong with you? Be grateful, be serious. Everybody has problem. What are you trying to do? Just get more, like pull your big girl pants and just do the work. And I was getting torn between those two emotions I was feeling, which is like the deep inner critic who was telling me that no, you are the problem, everything is okay, everybody goes through the problems, just do the work. And on externally, I was realizing there's a part of me who was saying, I don't want to work. It felt like literally I'm dragging a little baby in me to like get out of the work and go to the office. It was tiring. It was not at all fun. And unconsciously, I did it for 6 months, to the point I realized I have to ask this question myself, that how long I can do this, how long I can drag myself out of my bed to go to the work. And it's not even like the dragging part. It's like even when I'm on commuting, I'm sad, I'm crying, I want to be anywhere but at work. And when I'm entering the work, I had the whole charade of like tears dropping out and just rubbing it off and like putting a mask of like, I am perfect, everything is perfect, and I'm ready to nail the day. Where inside I'm just like, when will be the 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock click so I can just rush out of this place. And that really made me, that crack, while did not I still did not had understanding at that time, it really made me ask the question like, what is going on and how long I can do it. The answer was clear to me that I cannot long do it for very long, but I still did not have the clarity of what is going on. So I thought, like any other who would have feel, I need rest. I decided to take a break for 3 weeks, and it was a much needed break. But after the break, I still realized that I still don't feel like going back to the job. And knowing now, because it's been 7 years since that incident, when I look back at that version of me, she still did not have the answer. And but I feel like when I look at back, it wasn't the rest I needed, because yes, I was maybe tired, but more than tired, there was something deeper happening inside, which was like a crack becoming visible, which was telling that, hey, you have made the work your entire worth. You are your title, and your productivity defines how much worthy you are. But there was a version of me who were afraid to blow things up, who were every single day questioning that, what if I made any mistake and now my worth is all gone? Because if my worth equals to the productivity I'm producing, my mistakes would mean my own personal flaws. And because it was all coming to light, I felt like it's getting scary. So now, when I look back at that version of me, and if many of us can relate to this story, because I know you two surely can, and any of us listening, and they can too, we need to we know this feeling of like knowing inherently, is this me, or like, is it the work? But the crack was opening, and that was making me question how long I can do this, how long it can continue. But that was the story, and that led me to question that there is a mask I'm wearing. Maybe am not who I was. Like the person who started in that career was very excited, was very aligned with the work. And from now I can look back, that that version of me wasn't really in problem with the work. It wasn't like she doesn't want to work anymore. It was like she became or overgrown to a person who behind her deeper insight hasn't like resonated with the way the work was happening, or the way her expression were being called to. So she was called to like perform the way others are performing, laugh when everyone is laughing, whether she feel like or not. Just say yes whenever it feels like, and do not express your truest authentic self, your truest authentic feeling. And that felt like suffocation between the disconnect that is happening between the mask or the version, the actor that is getting portrayed at the work floor, versus the one crying, screaming behind the scenes, behind the stage of the inner psychology. And that disconnect is where I would say that where the professional mask begin to wear off. But Vidya, I know from your experience, you have been into the AI and tech field. And I would like to put this question to your bucket now because nowadays AI is everywhere. And a lot of people are afraid like AI is gonna replace their job. Even the people who are in the tech sometimes feel this disconnect like AI is gonna take away my job or there's too much competition. So then from a perspective of a tech person who is coming from the AI field and you know the ins and outs of the AI and technology, what do you think happening when people start connecting their self-worth to productivity?
That's, I think, the question which is more like the need of the hour to address. And I will just build on what you said. I think the mask you're wearing is what is protecting you. So it's easier to recognize it to be a mask. And what happens when it starts working for you, then it becomes much more harder to see. In tech, and especially in the current ages that we live in, what is happening is everybody is in a position where they are challenging themselves. They're asking themselves, what is their worth or being worthy anymore? What does that mean for them? Because I think people would have spent 10, 15 years building their expertise, doing things the way they are doing it, the speed, the momentum that they built. I think all of that is now basically done at a click of a button with an AI. But let me tell you, AI is still not there. AI can give you advice, but it is not there executing autonomously. So the ground is shaking, but that doesn't mean that everything now is falling apart. And going back to your question, in tech and in startup environments, especially, I think performance is very visible. Output is definitely reported, and speed is definitely a criteria to be rewarded as well. Reliability is the major thing that any startup would bank on. And when that version of you that delivers constantly keeps getting recognized, promoted, and trusted with more responsibilities, I think it feels like that version of you is the only version that is allowed to exist all the time because that's what is getting rewarded. And for me, I think this showed up in a period where things were actually going well in my career. Projects were moving forward, responsibilities were, of course, skyrocketing. And from the outside, it looked like a natural progression. And I think the feedback that I was receiving back then was super positive that I am reliable and the company can depend on me and someone who could handle complexity. I think I wore it as a badge back then. But internally, something subtle was happening. The better the performance worked, I think I questioned it the very least. And slowly, my self worth was being tied to productivity. I started working
Mhm.
long hours. It felt like I'm committed to work. Saying yes means that I am signaling reliability to the company. And delivering consistently became part of how I understood myself and my values. And back then, I think that none of this really felt any dramatic. It felt like I'm being super professional, I'm owning my job. But over time, I started noticing something that success can actually reinforce this mask or the adaptation that we create for ourselves. And the promotions are the ones that validate that mask that we are wearing. The version
Mhm.
of you that gets rewarded becomes the version that is expected out of you. And eventually, you stop asking which version is really you because it's all completely merged. And I think the shift that we are speaking about, right? I think it didn't come from probably a dramatic moment, as you just said. It started with me noticing small things. And for me, where the effort wasn't coming from work itself, it was more that I had to maintain that mask all the time at work. And this is where I started paying more attention into my inner signals, where I felt I naturally do not exist. So I have one version of me that is always performing. And for everybody who's listening, my goal wasn't to remove that mask completely, because I think professional environments always require some kind of adaptation. But the goal is to remember that we are wearing that mask. But over time, many things subtly changes and shifts. The work itself doesn't necessarily become harder. It becomes harder to sustain that version of yourself at work. And and that's where a different experience begins to emerge, which is not burnout, but it's disconnection. So let me ask Gandharvi this question. At what point does high performance stop feeling energizing and start feeling super effortful in a new way?
It's a very important question because I think when something starts to feel difficult in our careers, we often assume it's burnout. And, we all know burnout really comes from depletion. So, too much work, too many demands, too many meetings, trying to meet everyone's expectations. And when someone's experiencing burnout, usually if you slow down or rest, that energy gradually comes back. So, staycations, short break, take a day off, you feel so much better and you feel like you're re energized. But there's another experience that looks similar from the outside but feels very different on the inside, and that is disconnection. So, from what my experience has been, that disconnection usually has happened when externally you're doing really well, right? You're capable, you're delivering, you're trusted, everybody comes to you for getting work done. But internally, something about sustaining that performance and that standard and level begins to feel more effortful than it did before. So, whether you may say I'm a perfectionist, I'm going to get it all done, I have extremely high standards, but at the end of the day, when that effort starts kicking in around performance, that's where it possibly is something to look at. Now, when I experienced it, and everything in my career looked great. I had spent over 2 decades building a career in HR across organizations. I was, working with senior leaders in a senior role, involved in all the leadership conversations and people-related strategy one could think of. From the outside, if you saw me, it all made sense. I think over time, I realized something started feeling off within me. The work didn't become impossible. I knew I was still going to be able to do it, but it started feeling more effortful emotionally, mentally, in a way that it didn't feel before. So I noticed that I was constantly checking myself, or as they say, calibrating myself, right? I was checking how I was sounding, I was checking my reactions. I even started doing that at home, to ensure that everything kind of felt balanced. And I also, something I started doing was constantly interpreting how people saw me. And none of that felt dishonest in the professional world. It's called being professional, it's professionalism. And over time, that constant checking in, recalibrating, self reflecting all the time around this started to take on energy. And what surprised me was that when I was busy, it didn't matter. So it was when I was quiet, like my mind was empty or I was not doing much. The smaller moments is when I started noticing something. So when I say small moments, I mean going from the parking to the office building, waking up in the morning, and when I'm trying to get out of bed, I started having that quiet moment to start using and reflecting on this. And that's where something became really clear to me. The exhaustion that I had wasn't from workload because I was always working and it never really bothered me before. It was from maintaining this version of myself that could carry all that workload. So it was me trying to keep a check on myself emotionally, mentally, getting all the work done. And that's when I understood the difference between depletion and disconnection. So depletion came from doing too much, working extra hours, going above and beyond. But the disconnection actually came from trying to sustain that version of myself for so long. It was like I was trying to make everyone happy in some way or the other. And I started to actually lose touch with what felt more normal and natural for me versus what felt as being managed. I was literally managing myself. And once I understood that, the response for me wasn't to make a dramatic decision or walk away from it. I think it was to just start noticing again how I was, what I was feeling, and to notice where I felt more myself rather than where I was constantly having to check in on myself. And it's the quiet realization that helped me move from this depletion, disconnection, to actually becoming more aware and more myself. And when that mask it's still there, I'm sure, for everyone, but the idea is I'm still more aware now. So that's my story around how I felt it was so effortful. And today, even if it feels effortful, I know why. um, so I'm going to take it forward, Simi and Vidya, and do a quick summary for the audience as well. So we've spoken about protecting ourselves, the mask. We've spoken about success reinforcing performance in some way or the other, and we've also spoken a little bit about disconnection. But I'm sure for everyone who listened to this later on or is listening in now, the question is, what do I do? How do I make this practical? So whoever is listening and recognizes themselves in this, what do you actually do next? So, we've pulled together some questions that have come up again and again in the conversations we've had with a variety of people. So, Simi, I have a question that I'm going to, ask you first, which is, how does one reduce fear around income if they want to actually make a shift?
That's a very good question because, to be very honest, in finance world, finances are important, especially when you have like already financial commitments that you need to take care of. Blowing things off is not easy. And at the same time, that constant disconnect between the situation you are and how you are feeling it within, which is not in alignment, and the two parts are not supporting each other, it gets very difficult, like how to keep going. So it, from my own journey, I felt like when I asked that question, then how long I can drag myself to work, there was a fear behind as well, that how I'm gonna survive without a paycheck. I have financial commitments. What I'm gonna do? What if nothing works out? But I think at that time I did not have the clarity. Again, I mentioned, like, when I was in that situation, I still had no idea what exactly is going on, and I was just interpreting by going with the flow and whatever I was seeing externally. So I blew off. I quit my job with no plan, no savings, no nothing, and I was like, "We'll figure it out. We'll go for a ride." And which is like very subjective opinion whether she should quit or not. But what I will say to anyone who are listening to this conversation is, the reason you are asking this question already to yourself is being you are already ahead of that version of me who were not even asking this question, who were just so stuck and have no clarity. And all of us have very subjective experiences, even if the journey feels like similar. The inner scenario, the behind the scene scenarios could be different. Maybe some of you do not have any financial commitment and it's easy for you to make one set of decision, but some of you like hold a lot of financial commitments, and you need to plan, and there's a lot of dependency on you, and you need to plan your finances while navigating the situation. So what I would suggest, and to you and to the version of me from 7 years ago, is find someone who has worked on this path, someone who has clarity because they know the nuances of it, and then talk to them. Seek the clarity from them about what really the situation is, what is going on, and then from that perspective, decide that how you're going to approach this deeper disconnect. Because when you're going to get clarity, you're going to get that saying that, okay, this is not just me hating the word, it is just that I have overgrown to some other version and not not fully landed into that version. So maybe you need some help, someone who can help you come out of that version, that mask, and land into a version who can sustain the work and the demands and the urgency also keeping you fulfilled. So my suggestion to the version of me back and to everyone listening would be seek clarity first before you decide to blue things off.
Thank you, Simmi. I think that's so true for most people. However, there's another question, and I
Mhm.
think this is a little tricky. A lot of people ask, "Is staying for stability wrong?" What do you think?
Yeah, this is an actually interesting question. And there's no a right or wrong answer to it. Again, I don't want to sound like diplomatic person who is not taking a stand, but really, again, it comes back to the individual situation and scenario, because finances are the bread and butter of our working. Whether you want to stay on your job, or even if you want to start your own dream business, your passion, you need money to keep going. Otherwise, this survival stuff and the stress and fear is going to drag this inner conflict to a deeper level, and it's going to only enhance it. So asking this question, that whether staying for the stability is right and wrong, is definitely a good question to ask. And more important than anyone else, I feel like the person in the position, the person who is asking the question, can answer this question better for themselves with the guidance of someone who has walked the path and who can show them a clarified version of the things they cannot see and the pieces they cannot see. Because you know your situation way better than anyone. You know how much you have to, how much bandwidth you have, how much energy you have within, how much dependency you have on you, and how much financial commitments and financial obligations you have, and how much you need. So the need, the urgency, the time frames is something only you can answer, and it's subjective because it's going to change from person to person. But sitting that information and sharing it with someone who has walked the path, who has the clarity, who has lived a whole difficult way, with maybe with the trial and testing, they can tell you based on your inputs that what would be the best path for you. And like I said, we all have shared this thing. None of this required, when this happened, the situations happened in our life, none of us dramatics. It were like small fragments taking shape. And I feel like it doesn't have to like a dramatic change as well. We can start fixing small steps at a time, small pivots at a time, and see what is working for us. And maybe these small steps begin to form us better clarity of where we want to go. So that would be my answer to anyone wondering about whether staying for stability is right or wrong. But again, thinking about the questions, I have a question for Vidya now. Vidya, you were talking about identifying our self worth to the productivity, and I know I did that. I was with you when you said you were working long hours because that's your identity, and saying no felt like uh, something disconnecting to ourselves, like saying no to myself. This is my whole identity. How can I say no? So, what would you say to someone who is listening right now, or a 7-year-old version of me, who thinks their entire self worth is tied around their productivity?
Well, I'm glad you found that aha moment as well, just like I did. I think many of our listeners will also do the same. Um, and going back to that discussion that we were having, productivity and tying our self worth to it, I think the first thing I would say is that this pattern usually develops for a very specific reason. Because in most professional environments, productivity is what gets measured. You are rewarded and recognized, and that's the currency that high performing professionals are getting used to. So it is very natural for the mind to start linking output with value. The difficulty, I think, begins when productivity stops being something that we do and starts becoming how we evaluate ourselves and how we see ourselves. And that shift is usually gradual, like we spoke about in many, many conversations are ours. So no one consciously decides and give their, power to worth depending on how much they produce. I think it happens because the system consistently rewards performance, and that creates a demand that you be that kind of a person who performs in a certain way. So I think the first step isn't trying to suddenly detach from productivity. Don't shake the ground, people. That's the first rule. Work will always require some kind of a performance at some level. The first step, I think, is to simply notice when worth and productivity have quietly merged in your brains. For example, let's say when you have a slower day, a Wednesday or a Friday, and you immediately start feeling guilt because rest feels like you're falling behind. Those reactions are often the signals that the equation has formed internally inside your brain. So, what begins to help over time, I think, is to rebuild your reference point for your self worth and value. Think about conversations, relationships, even, or learning, things that have value when nothing is measured. That is your new reference point for value. So productivity can remain the same, which is important, but it stops being the only way you understand yourself. I think we have spoken about this in length about how adaptation becomes the problems when it becomes our unconscious way of living. So the
Mm-hmm.
real shift, I think, begins when we are aware and when we are noticing that productivity is something that we are doing versus something that you're using yourself to define how you rate yourself. So I think that's the summation I would give.
Interesting. And then I have a follow-up question to that. What if someone don't even aware, because you talked about awareness, that they are performing a role, like they are, without even knowing that they are doing it with a role?
I think more or less it's a very common experience for people, Simi. And I think it happens for people who have been performing well for a very long time. It comes in as a natural habitat kind of a situation. Um, when a role has structured your decisions, I think your priorities and even your daily rhythm, the way like Gandharvi was saying, you wake up, you reflect, you keep doing things, that daily rhythm for quite a long time, years put together, it naturally becomes a major reference point for identity. So when people ask themselves, who am I without that role? I think the most honest answer at that, flashpoint is, I'm not completely sure yet. And that's
Mhm.
okay too. And that uncertainty isn't a failure. So it simply happens when external structures that you have been using to define yourself is no longer there or is falling apart. And I think we have spoken about how prolonged performance can reduce access to your internal signals. So that I think is the place where everything starts to disrupt. So preferences, curiosity, intuition, they never disappear. They just become quieter over time. And so it becomes harder to tell the difference between what you genuinely want and what you have learned that actually gets rewarded and works. So
Mhm.
rediscovering identity is very important, and it doesn't usually happen through a dramatic decision. So no big explosions in your head or no big aha moments. I think it happens through smaller observation. Smaller observations could be questions like, what energizes me? What topics come to me when nothing is at stake? And if something goes away, does it feel like a relief? Right? So these are things that are smaller signals that often is the beginning of reconnection of those parts that were never actually gone, but it just got quieter. So I think gradually restoring the access to one is what will help people reconnect and join the bridge back. But talking about that, I have a question for Gandharvi now. How do I know if I'm disconnected or I'm just tired?
I don't think I have anything that's rocket science to suggest. However, I believe in simplicity. So I think I'm going to keep it simple by saying one simple way is to tell how your system responds to rest. When you're tired, it's usually capacity, as I had said before, and you've been doing a lot. When you take the time off, you rest, your energy comes back, and then the work feels great again. Your mood is up, you feel good about everything. Disconnection obviously is different. Even when you rest, the effort to do everything else still remains. You can still do the work, but sustaining it feels more difficult and heavier. So, in my view, I think we talked about self awareness, clarity, the subconscious, unconscious way of dealing with things, right? We just have to start observing. So, you could start noticing when you're monitoring yourself more. So, are you checking your tone too much, your reactions, or do you feel relief when that meeting that you didn't want to go to gets cancelled? I think those are some of the signals you could start looking at to actually know if you are disconnected or just simply tired. And I think, as I had said, through my story as well, that it showed up only through a quiet phase, when things were quieter. And to what Vidya was also mentioning, it's about noticing that quiet space, what energizes you, what keeps you motivated, what you're passionate about. And I think that will be your first step. We don't need to go to step 10 today. I think step 1 is to figure out how your body and your mind and your system responds to those triggers, to those reactions, and especially to rest.
Okay, so now that let's say that people have reflected, now they understand that they are disconnected. For the benefit of our viewers, how do you suggest that I reconnect with myself without quitting?
I think in all our stories and experiences, we've realized it's never been dramatic. It could have been dramatic for a lot of people who are listening in, but for us and most women, it's never a dramatic decision. And I think that's the whole point around reconnection. It usually doesn't require anything dramatic. It starts with restoration. And restoration starts when you start becoming more aware, when you start realizing when you are your absolute true natural self, and when you're not managing yourself in the day to day, when you don't have to have that mask on all the time, and you can be your true self, at least in your version of what means true to you. I think it's also to notice and become aware of which conversations you don't monitor yourself in. All this while we talked about how we are managing ourselves in conversations, but I think it's also important for us to figure out when are we not managing ourselves. And I think those are the signals that really help you start realizing where you can start reconnecting. I think another way is to figure out if it's relief rather than success. So, we talked about performance and how performance has been a driver for people to get validated, right? I think when you succeed, you get validation. I'm great, I'm amazing, I can do it all. But relief often tells you where something feels more aligned. So, if you are successful at a project, as an example, and you feel relief and you have validation, that's great. But if you have been successful at a project and you don't feel any relief, then something is misaligned. So the goal isn't, in all honesty, when you reconnect, the goal is not to remove your mask completely. By just becoming more aware, by understanding if there's relief or if there is validation and success, I think the mask will still be there. But the goal actually becomes to know when you're wearing it, and to remember that it's not entirely who you are. We all have to do that at some point of time. But the idea is that this helps you at least become more aware and be your true self, even at times when the mask is on.
Yeah, that was so wonderfully said, Gandharvi. And to sum it off, what we all have said, that Being in the situation is not really a fault, and it's definitely not your fault. So thinking like you are broken is not the truth here. The thing is, more often these situations happen unconsciously and it's very subtle. But as many of us has pointed, and Vidya also said that it doesn't have to be like you don't, if you don't know and if you're into in the uncertainties, it doesn't mean that you're wrong or weak. Observation is the first step, as Gandharvi has also pointed out. And I feel like when you start observing and taking the note of what is actually going on, what is make you feel like you're tying your success to your own entire worth of who you are, and when you're wearing the mask and when you're like projecting yourself out in a way that isn't aligned with your honest true self, when you start seeing that and observing that and build that awareness muscle between you in your body, in your bones, that's the point when you feel like you are achieving a real freedom where you know who you truly are while performing in whatever place you are, whether it's the corporate world, whether it's your own business. Work is not the problem, productivity is not the problem. It's leading the work and productivity from that place of knowingness that I am more deeper and it's not just tied to this fragmented mass that feels like my entire world and worth is tied to. That was such a wonderful conversation, and I would like to ask the people who are listening, what part of you you felt that we expressed or we shared the similar parts with you? What parts of you in this journey of us from different domains you felt like made you feel seen or made you feel heard? We would like to hear from you about your experiences and where you are in your journey.
Absolutely. And I'll just echo what Simi just said and, thank everyone for being part of this conversation. We hope something is ignited in you today. And if it is, and today has made you pause, that's usually a signal. And that's exactly the work Simi, Vidya, and I do on a daily basis. So thank you once again for being part of this conversation. You can continue to follow us and join us in similar conversations as we continue to grow this space. And in the end, I hope you know when your mask is on and what you want to start protecting going forward. So, thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye bye.
Bye.